They say you can't run from your problems. But for Nora Charles, running was the only answer left. She was an illustrator, a woman who created perfect worlds on paper but couldn't fix the wreckage of her own. With her heart shattered by a betrayal that left her breathless, she seeks refuge in the one place that promises peace. An isolated cottage where the only sound is the crashing of the waves. It's a small, controlled world she builds for herself, a sanctuary to lick her wounds in silence. But Solitude has a neighbor, and he lives in a fortress of glass and steel that looms like an omen beside her refuge. He is Cassian Valenti, a man carved from shadows and silence, a billionaire recluse to the world, a predator in the unseen corners of it. He doesn't come with an ultimatum. He comes with a storm, with a gaze that strips her bare, and with a gentleness that contradicts the dangerous aura surrounding him. Their connection is like the ocean at their door, beautiful, deep, and utterly terrifying. She came to the beach seeking peace, but she found a silent war in the eyes of the man next door. This is the story of a woman who ran to the edge of the world to heal, only to find a danger more seductive than any safety she'd ever known. It is a tale of how the quietest man can hold the loudest secrets, and how a woman running from love might be the only one brave enough to face a man defined by war. So take a deep breath, and let the tide pull you into our story. Comment with a wave emoji if you believe love can be a perfect storm, and subscribe for more tales of dangerous men and the women who dare to love them. Get ready for a story that proves that sometimes the most dangerous place is the only one where you can truly be safe. It's a story about a quiet refuge and the dangerous man who lives next door. The key turned in the lock with a tired, metallic sound, like a sigh of relief. Nora Charles pushed the cottage door open, and the scent hit her first, a mixture of salt, aged wood, and the faint mustiness of the sea air. It was the smell of escape, the smell of a new beginning. Behind her, the gravel of the driveway crunched under her feet as she went back to get the last box from the car. Every muscle in her body protested, tense from the long drive and the emotional weight of the last few months. The box, filled with art supplies, felt like it weighed a ton. It was all that was left of her old life, her old studio, of him. She dropped the box onto the plank floor, the thud echoing in the silence of the place. Dust danced in the beams of the setting sun that cut through the room. The place was rustic, just like in the pictures, perhaps a little more so. The light wood walls were the color of honey, and a large glass window framed the view that had convinced her to spend all her savings. The ocean. Gray and turbulent under the late afternoon sky, the waves crashed on the sand in a hypnotic and constant cadence. A dry sob scratched at her throat, one she swallowed hard. The tears she refused to shed seemed to weigh behind her eyes. No crying, she ordered herself. You came here to heal, not to drown in self-pity. As she unpacked, exhaustion began to give way to a strange sense of peace. The rhythm of the waves was a balm. The salty air seemed to cleanse her lungs of the stagnant city air, the smoke of cafes where she had waited for him in vain, his scent that still stubbornly clung to a forgotten scarf. Here there was only the smell of the sea. That's when she noticed it. Next to her small and humble cottage, separated by a strip of wild grass and a low stone fence, stood a fortress. It wasn't a house. It was a statement. A structure of concrete, dark glass, and steel that seemed to have been carved from the cliffside itself. It was modern, minimalist, and utterly intimidating. The floor-to-ceiling windows were like black, impenetrable eyes, reflecting the gray sky and hiding whatever was inside. It contrasted so brutally with her cottage that it was almost absurd. Who would live in a place like this? So isolated, so exposed, and yet so closed off. An unwanted curiosity pricked at her. She moved closer to the kitchen window, which overlooked the neighboring property. There was no sign of life, no car in the polished stone driveway, no lights on, though dusk was already painting the world in purple and orange. Perhaps it was empty, a summer house for some billionaire who only showed up once a year. Better that way. Solitude was what she had come for. The next day, Nora woke to the sound of seagulls. For the first time in months, she didn't feel that knot of anxiety in her stomach. She made strong coffee and took it to the small front porch, wrapped in a thick sweater. The morning air was cold and sharp. Sitting there with her sketchbook in her lap, she began to draw the waves, the fluid lines, the white foam, the relentless force. That's when she saw him. A figure. A man. He was on the upper terrace of the mansion, a dark silhouette against the pale morning sky. He was standing perfectly still, looking out at the sea. Even from that distance, Nora felt an intensity emanating from him. He wasn't relaxing. He seemed to be watching the ocean as if expecting it to give him answers or perhaps to bring him an enemy. He turned his head slowly, and even without being able to see his eyes, Nora felt the weight of his gaze sweep across the beach, past her cottage. She instinctively shrank back, as if she could become invisible. How ridiculous, she thought, her face growing warm. He doesn't even know I'm here. But her heart was hammering against her ribs. There was something about him, a dangerous stillness. He stood there for another minute, a monolith of loneliness and power, and then turned and disappeared inside the house, leaving Nora with a shaky sketch and an unsettling feeling that her much-desired solitude had just gained a neighbor who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. In the days that followed, Nora's routine settled. Mornings of sketching on the porch, long walks on the beach with Pip, her small, fearless mutt, and afternoons trying to work on freelance illustrations, though her inspiration was still wounded. The mysterious neighbor was a phantom presence. She would hear the low rumble of an expensive car arriving late at night and leaving before dawn. Sometimes she would see his silhouette in the window, watching the sea. She never saw him up close, and she preferred it that way. That man, whoever he was, radiated an energy that put her on edge. He was the kind of man she had spent her whole life running from. Intense, complicated, dark. Until the afternoon when Pip, in a burst of canine euphoria, shot off after a seagull, squeezing through a gap in the stone fence and invading the mansion's immaculate lawn. "Pip, come back here!" Nora yelled, panic rising in her throat. The last thing she wanted was to confront the neighbor. She ran to the fence, her heart leaping. "Pip, come!" The little dog, oblivious to the diplomatic danger, was rolling on the perfectly manicured grass. And then, a glass door slid open silently. The man appeared. Up close, he was even more impressive. Tall, with broad shoulders that filled the doorway. He wore dark trousers and a black long-sleeved linen shirt, rolled up at the forearms, revealing tanned skin and defined muscles. His hair was dark and short, and his face, it was a study in angles and shadows. A strong jaw, lips that didn't smile, and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the light around them. He didn't look annoyed. In fact, he didn't look like anything. His face was a mask of absolute control. He looked at little Pip, then raised his gaze to Nora, who stood frozen on the other side of the fence. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. "Is she yours?" His voice hit her. It was deep and calm, with a timbre that vibrated through the air, deeper than the sound of the waves. Nora swallowed. Yes. I'm so sorry. She got out. I'll get her. She started looking for a place to jump the low fence, feeling clumsy and foolish. But before she could move, the man took a step forward, crouched down, and held out his hand to Pip. The little dog, who normally barked at strangers, ran to him, wagging her tail and licking his hand. Nora's jaw dropped. He scratched behind Pip's ears, the gesture surprisingly gentle. Then, he picked her up with an ease that belied his intimidating aura and walked to the fence. He stopped a few feet from Nora, and she could see the stubble that shadowed his jaw and the way his eyes analyzed her. It wasn't a lecherous look. It was assessing, as if he were cataloging every detail, every strand of hair loosened by the wind, the flush on her cheeks. "I believe this belongs to you." He passed Pip over the fence. Their hands brushed for a brief second as she took the little dog. His skin was warm, his grip firm. An electric shock, tiny and undeniable, shot up Nora's arm. She pulled back as if she'd been burned. "Thank you. And I'm sorry, again. It won't happen again." Her voice came out weaker than she intended. He just nodded, his gaze still fixed on hers. There was a universe of secrets in those dark eyes. "The fence needs fixing." It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. "Yes, I'll talk to the owner." He watched her for another moment, a moment that felt like an eternity. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back into his glass fortress, the door sliding shut behind him, leaving Nora with a racing heart, her skin tingling where he had touched her, and the absolute certainty that her peaceful refuge had been irrevocably invaded. The week following the incident with Pip was charged with a silent tension. Nora felt watched. Whenever she was on the porch, she felt a prickle on the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of eyes on her. She forced herself not to look at the mansion, to keep her focus on her sketches, but her hand trembled slightly, betraying the calm she tried to project. Who was this man? The way he moved, with an economy of motion that bordered on lethal, the calm in his voice that seemed to conceal a contained fury. He intrigued and frightened her in equal measure. "Keep your distance," the sensible part of her brain said. But the wounded part, the part that had come to the beach to feel something, anything other than the pain of betrayal, was dangerously curious. The nights became more restless. The image of him, crouching to pet Pip with such contradictory gentleness, returned to her mind. The warmth of his skin against hers. It was madness. She barely knew him, but his presence filled the loneliness in a way that left her disconcerted. On Friday, the sky, which had been a clear blue for days, began to darken. Heavy lead-colored clouds rolled in from the ocean, swallowing the horizon. The wind howled, whipping sand against the cottage windows. A storm was coming, one of those autumn storms that the locals respected. Nora checked the window latches, feeling a pang of anxiety. Being alone in a wooden cottage during a violent storm was not exactly comforting. When the rain fell, it was as if the sky had opened up. Torrents of water battered the roof and walls, and the sound of the waves turned into a furious roar. The lights flickered once, twice. On the third, they plunged the cottage into total, abrupt darkness. Thunder rumbled, shaking the structure, and Nora let out a small scream, her heart leaping into her throat. She stood motionless in the darkness, listening to the fury of the world outside. The silence inside the cottage was almost as deafening as the storm's noise. Her hands searched for her phone. The screen's glow a small island of light in the blackness. No signal, and of course no internet. Perfect. She fumbled through the kitchen for candles, her hands shaking. She found a candle stub and a box of damp matches. After several attempts, the flickering flame finally came to life, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. She sat on the sofa, hugging her knees, feeling small and vulnerable. That's when she heard the knock on the door. Loud, firm, overriding the sound of the rain. Nora's heart stopped. Who could it be? On a night like this, fear, cold and irrational, enveloped her. She held her breath, hoping that whoever it was would go away. The knock came again, more insistent. With trembling legs, she got up, picking up the makeshift candlestick. Hot wax dripped onto her fingers. She approached the door. "Who is it?" Her voice was a frightened whisper. "It's your neighbor." The deep, calm voice came through the wood, unmistakable. "Are you all right? I saw your lights go out." Her neighbor, Cassian. She didn't know his name, but the voice was unmistakable. A contradictory relief flooded her, mixed with a new wave of nervousness. What should she do? "He's a stranger," Reason warned. "But you're alone, in the dark, in a storm," survival instinct countered. Making a decision, she unlocked the door and opened it a crack. He was standing on the covered porch, the rain falling in curtains behind him. He was soaked, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his black shirt clinging to his chest, outlining powerful muscles. He held a large modern lantern that emitted a strong white light, bathing his face in light and shadow, making his features even more defined and dangerous. His dark eyes met hers in the dimness. "Are you alone?" he asked, his tone neutral but his gaze intense. She just nodded, unable to speak. "My house has generators. You can't stay here in the dark. It's dangerous." It wasn't an invitation. It was an order disguised as concern. He glanced at the trembling candle in her hand, and a shadow of something that could have been amusement, or perhaps contempt, crossed his lips. I'm fine," she lied, her voice failing. "No, you're not." He held out his free hand. "Come." You can wait there until the power comes back. Nora hesitated. Going to that man's house, to that glass fortress. It was crossing a line she might not be able to return from, but the alternative was staying here, alone, with a candle and the sound of the storm as her only company. Looking into his eyes, she saw no threat. She saw control, an absolute certainty that was, somehow, comforting. She blew out the candle, grabbed a coat and her key, and locked the door behind her. He waited for her patiently, shielding her from the worst of the rain with his body. His scent hit her, a mix of rain, ozone, and something else, something purely masculine and intoxicating. They ran across the soaked grass. The wind whipped at her, and she stumbled. His hand was like lightning, grabbing her arm, firm and strong, steadying her. The touch, even through the fabric, sent a warmth spreading through her body, fighting the cold of the rain. The mansion door opened with a soft click. The inside was the opposite of Nora's cottage. The silence was the first thing she noticed. A deep silence, insulated from the chaos outside. The air was warm and dry. The floor was polished dark marble. The walls a mix of exposed concrete and dark wood panels. The decor was minimal, expensive and impersonal. It was less a home and more a corporate headquarters. "You can leave your coat there," he said, pointing to a designer bench. As she did, feeling awkward and out of place, he disappeared down a hallway. He returned moments later with a large, soft towel. "Dry yourself," he said, handing it to her. "Thank you." He watched her as she dried her hair, his gaze so intense she felt her skin burn. What does he want? The question echoed in her mind. "I'll get us something to drink. Whiskey?" I don't drink whiskey." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Wine, then." He led her to a vast living room, dominated by a floor-to-ceiling glass window that offered a spectacular and terrifying view of the storm over the ocean. The waves looked like monsters of black foam, hurling themselves at the shore. He lit a modern gas fireplace with the touch of a button, and the blue and orange flames danced, casting a warm glow over the cold room. He returned with 2 glasses of red wine. Silence settled between them, filled only by the soft crackle of the fire and the distant roar of the storm. Nora took a sip of wine, the velvety liquid warming her chest. She watched him. He was standing by the window, looking out at the storm. The firelight sculpted his profile, the straight line of his nose, the curve of his lips, the strength of his jaw. He seemed to belong to that storm. A man forged by fury and power. "Do you live here year-round?" she asked, her voice sounding small in the vastness of the room. He turned to her. "Most of the time, it's quiet." The irony of the word quiet, spoken by a man who seemed to carry a war inside him, was not lost on Nora. "And you?" he asked. "What's a city artist doing in a beach cottage in the middle of autumn?" The question caught her off guard. "How do you know I'm an artist?" His dark eyes glinted. "I see you, on your porch, with your sketchbooks." He paused. "You're running from something, or someone." The statement, direct and accurate, disarmed her. A hot blush rose up her neck. She looked away, staring at the flames. "I think we're all running from something." "Some escapes are more dangerous than others," he replied, his voice low and laden with a hidden meaning that made her shiver. He moved closer, stopping in front of her. Nora had to tilt her head back to look up at him. The space between them vibrated with a palpable energy. He raised his hand, and for a terrifying and exciting moment, she thought he was going to touch her. Instead, he tucked a damp strand of hair that had stuck to her cheek behind her ear. The brush of his fingers on her skin was like a hot coal. Slow, deliberate, incendiary. "You should be more careful," he whispered. "This place can be lonely, and loneliness attracts trouble." Her heart was hammering. She didn't know if he was warning her about the place or about himself. And the scariest part was, in that moment, she didn't care. The power only came back around midnight. During the hours that passed, the storm outside subsided from a roar to a constant murmur, and the tension inside Cassian's living room transformed into something different, something more intimate and dangerous. They talked, not about the past, not about the future, but about safe, impersonal things. Books, the fury of the sea, the strange beauty of autumn melancholy. Nora discovered that behind the silent facade, There was a sharp mind and a cutting intelligence. He spoke little, but every word was chosen with precision. Nora found herself relaxing, the wine warming her veins, the fire warming her skin. She allowed herself to forget why she was here, to forget the broken heart and the life she had left behind. In that cocoon of luxury and power, protected from the storm by the man who was, himself, a force of nature, she felt safe. It was a contradiction she couldn't decipher. When the lights of her cottage flickered on in the distance, visible through the panoramic window, it was like the end of a spell. "I guess that's my cue," Nora said, her voice a little hoarse. She stood up, suddenly feeling awkward again. The magic of the moment dissipated, leaving behind the reality. She was in the house of a powerful and enigmatic stranger in the middle of the night. "I'll walk you," Cassian said, standing up as well. His height and presence filled the room, making her feel small again. The walk back was silent. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and cold, smelling of wet earth and salt. Stars were beginning to pierce the tattered clouds. At the cottage door, Nora turned to him. The porch light illuminated his face, and for the first time, she saw something beyond control in his eyes, a shadow of vulnerability. No, that wasn't it. It was loneliness, a loneliness as deep and vast as the ocean before them. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere, "for everything, the shelter, the wine." He just nodded, his hands in his trouser pockets. Anyone would have done the same, but they both knew that wasn't true. Anyone wouldn't have his calm, his preparation. Anyone wouldn't have made her feel so safe and at the same time, so in danger. "My name is Nora," she offered, feeling she needed to fill the silence with something real, something to anchor her. He watched her for a long moment before answering. "Cassian." Cassian. The name suited him. It sounded strong, classic, with a touch of severity. "Good night, Nora," he said, the way her name sounded in his deep voice sending a shiver down her spine. "Good night, Cassian." She watched him walk away, a shadow moving with grace and purpose back to his glass fortress. As she entered the cottage, Nora leaned against the door, her heart beating erratically. She brought her fingers to her lips, still able to taste the wine and the electricity of his presence in the air. "Stay away from him," her mind screamed. But her heart, a foolish and treacherous organ, whispered a dangerous question. What if he's exactly what you need? In the days that followed, something changed. The invisible barrier between the two properties seemed to diminish. Sometimes when Nora was on the beach, she would see him walking near the water's edge, always alone, his hands in his pockets, his gaze lost on the horizon. He would nod at her, a small acknowledgement that felt like a shared secret. One afternoon, as she was struggling with a particularly difficult illustration, frustrated with her lack of inspiration, she heard a knock on the door. It was Cassian. He was holding 2 covered plates. "I made dinner," he announced without preamble. "I made too much." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. But Nora smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. "Are you trying to feed me?" "I'm trying to make sure my neighbor doesn't subsist on coffee and melancholy alone," he replied, a playful glint in his dark eyes. The smell was divine. Wild mushroom risotto. He came inside and placed the plates on Nora's small kitchen table. The gesture was so domestic, so normal, that it contrasted violently with everything she felt about him. They ate in a comfortable silence. The risotto was the best she had ever tasted. "You cook well?" she said, impressed. "One must have hobbies," he replied enigmatically. From that dinner on, their encounters became more frequent. He would bring her coffee in the morning. She, in turn, baked an apple cake and left it on his doorstep. They were small gestures, bridges being built over the chasm that separated their worlds. On a clear, cold night, he invited her to see the stars from his terrace. The terrace was equipped with a powerful telescope. He pointed out the constellations, his low, knowledgeable voice explaining the mythology behind each one. Nora found herself captivated not only by his intelligence, but by the quiet passion he displayed. "You seem to know a lot about ancient stories," she commented, looking at his face, illuminated only by the pale starlight. "Stories are about power, betrayal, and survival," he answered, his gaze fixed on the sky. they don't change much over time." Those words hung in the air, heavy with a weight that Nora felt but didn't understand. In that moment, standing beside him under the infinite canopy of the universe, she felt dangerously close to falling in love. The physical attraction she had felt from the beginning was deepening, transforming into an emotional connection that terrified her. She saw the darkness in him, but instead of backing away, she felt an inexplicable urge to understand it. He turned to her, and the vastness of the night sky seemed to concentrate in his eyes. The space between them shrank, every inch charged with a crackling electricity. The air grew thin, and Nora could only hear the sound of her own heart pulsing in her ears. "Nora," he whispered, and the sound of her name was both a question and a surrender. He raised his hand and caressed her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His skin was rough, the touch reverent. Nora closed her eyes, leaning into the touch, a gesture of trust she hadn't given anyone in a long time. "This is a bad idea," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," he replied, his voice hoarse. "The worst ideas are usually the best ones." And then he kissed her. It wasn't a tender kiss. It wasn't hesitant. It was a kiss of surrender, a kiss that spoke of loneliness, of contained desire, and of a hunger they both felt. His lips were firm and demanding, and Nora responded with the same intensity, her hands rising to tangle in his hair. He tasted of red wine and something else, something dangerous and wild. It was the taste of all the secrets he kept. The kiss deepened, becoming more desperate. He pulled her closer, his body hard and warm against hers, one hand cradling the back of her neck, the other sliding to the small of her back, pressing her against him until there was no more space, no air, no thought, only the overwhelming sensation of him. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, they stared at each other under the starlight. Cassian's mask of control had cracked, and in his eyes, Nora saw a whirlwind of emotions. Desire, possessiveness, and something that looked a lot like fear. "I warned you," he said, his voice almost a growl. "Loneliness attracts trouble." "And what if I don't mind the kind of trouble?" she replied, her voice braver than she had ever felt. He didn't answer. He just kissed her again. And this time, there was no turning back. Nora knew, with a terrifying clarity, that she was falling in love with a man who was an enigma, and that solving that enigma might cost her the very heart she had come here to mend. Or maybe, just maybe, it might save it. The first kiss was like the breaking of a dam. The carefully contained tension that had existed between them dissolved, unleashing a torrent of emotions and a desire that both had fought in vain to ignore. The following days were a feverish blur. The line between Nora's cottage and Cassian's mansion disappeared completely. The nights were spent in front of his fireplace, talking late, the wine replaced by an intimacy that was far more intoxicating. Cassian, the man of few words, began to open up. Not about his work or his past, those topics remained forbidden territories, surrounded by an impassable silence, but about the man behind the facade. He spoke of his love for classical music, of how a Mahler symphony could contain all the tragedy and beauty of life. He showed her his library, a hidden room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the scent of leather and old paper hanging in the air. He read philosophy, military history, poetry. Nora watched him, fascinated, trying to piece together the puzzle. How could a man be so cultured and, at the same time, carry such a palpable aura of danger? For Nora, it was like living in a dream. She felt seen in a way she had never experienced before. Cassian listened not only to her words, but to her silences. He looked at her drawings with a reverent intensity, seeing the emotions she poured onto the paper. He was protective in an almost primitive way. One day, while they were walking on the beach, a group of loud teenagers passed them, and one of them made a crude comment to Nora. Before she could react, Cassian stopped. He didn't say a word. He just turned and gave the boy a look so cold, so laden with a silent threat, that the young man turned pale, muttered an apology, and hurried away. Nora felt a chill. A part of her was frightened by the power he emanated, but another part, the part that had felt so small and helpless for so long, felt a comforting warmth. She was falling hopelessly in love. Her heart, which she thought was broken beyond repair, was healing under the touch and gaze of this enigmatic man. She ignored the red flags, the phone calls he always took in another room, the way his eyes would sometimes become distant and hard, as if he were solving problems in a world she wasn't part of. She told herself that everyone had secrets. What mattered was the man who was with her here, on the beach, the man who kissed her with a passion that left her breathless and held her through the night as if she were the only real thing in his universe. One evening, curled up on the sofa under a blanket, the fire crackling, Nora felt a sudden courage. "Cassian," she began, her voice soft, "I never ask you about your work." His body, which had been relaxed against hers, tensed subtly. It was an almost imperceptible shift, but Nora felt it. "There's not much to tell," he replied, his tone evasive. "I manage investments. It's complicated. Complicated enough to need a house that looks like a fortress and have a look that could stop a man's heart?" She pressed gently, trying to keep her tone light. He shifted slightly to look at her. The firelight danced on his face, creating shadows that hid his expression. Some investments require more security than others. "What kind of investments?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze lost in the flames. Nora felt she had pushed him away, that she had touched one of the walls he kept so firmly erected. She regretted the question. "Nora," he said finally, his voice deep and serious, "there are things about me you wouldn't understand. Things it's better you don't know." "Try me," she whispered, her hand finding his. His skin was cool. He looked down at her hand intertwined with his. Then he raised his gaze to hers, and the pain she saw there made her hold her breath, knowing would be dangerous for you. "And I won't let anything bad happen to you." It was a promise and a warning. It was also the end of the conversation. He pulled her close, kissed her forehead, and changed the subject. But the seed of doubt had been planted. "He's not protecting me from the world," she realized with a chill. "He's protecting me from himself." The first real crack in their bubble appeared a few days later. Nora was returning from a trip to the small nearby town to buy groceries. As she drove along the winding road leading to the cottages, a black sedan with tinted windows, which had been parked on the shoulder, started following her. At first, she thought nothing of it, but the car followed her all the way to the entrance of her property. It didn't turn in, just stopped on the road, watching. Nora's heart began to beat faster. She grabbed her groceries, locked the car, and rushed inside the cottage, closing the door behind her. Peeking through the window, she saw the car still parked there. 2 men were in the front seats, just silhouettes. Fear, cold and familiar, enveloped her. Was it paranoia, or something more? She reached for her phone to call Cassian, but hesitated. What would she say? That a car was scaring her? He would think she was foolish. But his warning echoed in her mind. Knowing would be dangerous for you. After 20 minutes that felt like an eternity, the black car started and drove away. Nora released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She tried to convince herself it was a coincidence, but the feeling of unease remained, a dissonant note in the symphony of her beach romance. That night, she didn't mention the car to Cassian. They had dinner, and she tried to act normally, but he noticed. He always noticed. "What is it?" he asked, studying her face from across the table. "Nothing, just tired." He narrowed his eyes. "You're lying. You bite your lower lip when you lie." She sighed, defeated. She told him about the black car, trying to minimize the fear in her voice. As she spoke, she saw Cassian's face transform. The tenderness vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, controlled fury. His jaw clenched, and his eyes became chips of ice. It was the same look he had given the man on the beach, but 1,000 times more intense, more deadly. When she finished, he stood up from the table. "Stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone," he ordered, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Cassian, what's happening? Where are you going?" Panic began to rise in her throat. He stopped and turned to her. He walked over to her and held her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Nora, I need you to trust me. Do you trust me?" She looked deep into his dark eyes, and despite the fear, despite the secrets, she nodded. "Yes." "Good." He kissed her, a quick, hard kiss. "I'll be back soon." And then he was gone. Nora watched him get into his own car, a black armored SUV she had never seen before, and speed away. She locked the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The night, which had once been her ally, now seemed full of shadows and threats. The sound of the waves was no longer comforting. It sounded like the harbinger of something terrible. She realized with a painful clarity that her escape had ended. She hadn't run from her old life to find peace. She had stumbled directly into the epicenter of someone else's war, and the man she had fallen in love with was, without a doubt, the general. The hours dragged on with torturous slowness. Nora paced the cottage, her heart leaping into her throat with every car headlight that passed on the distant road. She tried to draw, but her hands were shaking too much. She tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. The image of Cassian's face, transformed by that icy fury, was seared into her mind. It wasn't the anger of an ordinary man. It was something deeper, older. It was the fury of a predator whose territory had been invaded. And she realized with a shiver, was the territory. He returned just before dawn. The sound of his SUV on the gravel driveway sent Nora running to the window. He got out of the car, moving with a tired stiffness. When he entered the cottage, he had a key. She couldn't even remember when she'd given it to him. The faint morning light revealed what the darkness of the previous night had hidden. There was a thin cut above his eyebrow, with a little dried blood. The knuckles of his right hand were scraped and red. His previously immaculate shirt was wrinkled and had a small dark stain near the hem. Nora felt the air leave her lungs. "Cassian," she whispered, her voice failing. He looked up, and the mask of fury was gone, replaced by a deep exhaustion. He looked older, the weight of his double life visible in the lines around his eyes. "It's okay," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's over. They won't bother you again." "What happened? Who were they?" she asked, moving toward him, fear mixed with an overwhelming need to take care of him. "It doesn't matter." He held her by the arms, stopping her from getting closer, as if afraid to stain her with the violence that surrounded him. "Nora, what matters is that you're safe." "How can I be safe if I don't know what I'm being protected from?" she retorted, frustration and fear bubbling up. "Look at you. You're hurt." She pulled away from him and went to the bathroom, returning with a first aid kit. Her hands trembled as she cleaned the cut on his forehead with a cotton ball soaked in antiseptic. He flinched at the touch but remained still, his eyes fixed on her face, an unreadable expression on his features. "They work for a rival," he said finally, his voice so low she barely heard it. "Someone who wants what I have. They thought using you, scaring you, would be a way to get to me, to test me." "Test you?" she repeated, confused. "To see if I had a weakness." He raised his hand and touched her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. "And I do. It's you." The words hit her with the force of a wave. It wasn't a romantic declaration of love. It was a confession, an admission that her presence in his life, the light she had brought into his darkness, was also his greatest liability, his Achilles heel. Nora's heart ached. For him. For them. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Now you stay with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Not here, at my house, where I can protect you." She wanted to protest, to say she could take care of herself, but the truth was, she was terrified. The incident with the car, the state Cassian had returned in, this was real. His world, the world of complicated investments and rivals, had bled into hers. He helped her pack a small bag with the essentials. Clothes, her art supplies. Each object seemed to belong to another life, a life of simple problems like broken hearts and work deadlines. As she locked the cottage door, Nora felt like she was locking away a part of herself, the naive part that had believed running away to the beach could solve everything. At the mansion, the atmosphere was different. The house was no longer just a luxurious retreat. It was a fortress. Cassian took her to a guest room that was larger than her entire cottage, with a glass wall overlooking the ocean. But the view, once beautiful, now seemed threatening. "You'll be safe here," he promised. "No one can get in." That night, she couldn't sleep. The bed was soft. The sheets were a cotton that felt like silk, but she felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage. She got up and went to the living room. He was there, standing in front of the window, just as he had been the first time she saw him, a silhouette in the darkness, watching the sea. He turned as he heard her approach. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "I can't live like this, Cassian." In fear, not knowing what's happening. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "I know." He came to her and held her, wrapping her in his arms. She buried her face in his chest, inhaling his scent, feeling the warmth and strength of his body. It was the only place in the world she felt safe. "I never wanted this for you," he whispered into her hair. "When I first saw you, on your porch, so at peace, you were like a beacon. I should have stayed away, but I was selfish. I don't regret it," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. And it was true. Despite the fear, she didn't regret meeting him. He held her tighter. "I need to handle this, Nora, once and for all. But to do that, I need to know you're safe. I need you to stay here and trust me. Just a little longer." She lifted her face and kissed him. The kiss was different from the others. There was desperation in it, and fear, but also a deep connection. It was a kiss between two people from different worlds, clinging to each other in the middle of a storm. He picked her up in his arms, the gesture as natural as breathing. Nora wrapped her legs around his waist, her hands around his neck. He didn't take her to the guest room. He took her to his. Cassian's room was like the rest of the house. Large, minimalist, dominated by shades of gray and black. The only color came from the ocean, visible through the enormous window. He laid her on the bed, the cool silk of the sheets against her skin. Moonlight bathed the room, silvering his features. He undressed without hurry, his eyes never leaving hers. His body was a tapestry of power and discipline. Nora saw in the dim light the pale shadow of a scar on his ribcage, a silent map of the battles he had fought. When they were finally skin to skin, she gasped. His body was warm, solid, potent. He leaned over her, propping himself up on his elbows. He didn't kiss her. He just looked at her. And in that look, Nora saw everything. The loneliness, the fury, the desire, and a love so fierce it frightened her. "Tell me to stop, Nora," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Tell me now and I'll stop." She raised her hand and touched the scar on his ribcage. She traced the line of marked skin, feeling the history she didn't know. She didn't want him to stop. She wanted to know all his scars, the visible and the invisible. "Don't stop," she whispered back. A sigh escaped his lips, a sound of relief and surrender. He kissed her again, deeper, hungrier. His hand slid over her body, a touch that was both reverent and possessive. Every caress, every kiss, was a silent promise of protection and a confession of his dangerous love. That night, in Cassian's fortress, with the sound of the ocean as their witness, Nora gave herself to him completely, knowing she was surrendering not just to the man, but to his entire dark world. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid. The next morning dawned clear and calm, a blatant lie in the face of the previous night's turmoil. Nora woke slowly, feeling the weight of an arm across her waist. She was nestled against Cassian's warm body, their legs intertwined. The sound of his deep, steady breathing was the only thing in the room besides the distant murmur of the waves. In the soft morning light, his guard down in sleep, he looked different. Less a crime boss, less a predator, and more just a man who carried the world on his shoulders. She moved carefully so as not to wake him, turning to watch him. The lines of worry on his forehead were smoothed away. The cut above his eyebrows seemed less severe in the daylight. She felt a wave of tenderness so overwhelming it almost hurt. It wasn't just passion or attraction anymore. It was love. A complicated, terrifying, undeniable love. What have I done? She asked herself, not with regret, but with a lucid awareness of the gravity of her choice. She slid out of bed, pulling on his black linen shirt, which hung on her like a dress. The fabric still carried his scent, a mix of expensive cologne, ozone, and something uniquely him. She went to the window and looked out at the sea. The ocean was calm, the surface shimmering under the rising sun. It seemed like a mirror, reflecting the superficial calm she tried to project, while underneath, the currents were strong and dangerous. "I like seeing you in my clothes." His deep voice made her jump. He was awake, propped up on one elbow in bed, watching her. There was a warmth in his eyes she had never seen before, an intimacy that belonged only to that morning, that space. "Good morning," she said, smiling, a blush rising up her neck. "Good morning," he replied, the corner of his lips curving into a rare, genuine smile. It transformed him completely, giving her a glimpse of the man he might have been in another life. He held out his hand to her. "Come here." She went back to the bed, and he pulled her into his arms. His kiss was soft, full of the vulnerability that only the morning after a first night together can bring. There was no urgency, just a deep, comforting connection. "Are you okay?" he asked, his forehead resting against hers. "Yes," she answered, and it was true. In that moment, in his arms, she was okay. The days that followed were strangely domestic. Nora found herself living in the mansion, with Cassian working from his home office, a room with state-of-the-art technology from which she was kept at a distance. He insisted she try to maintain her routine. She set up a small makeshift studio in a corner of the guest room, the ocean light flooding her watercolors. But concentration was difficult. The constant presence of two men in suits, discreet and silent, who acted as Cassian's security, was a constant reminder of the danger. Their names were Marco and Leo, and they treated her with a distant respect that made her uncomfortable. Cassian made an effort to compartmentalize his life. When he was with Nora, he was just Cassian. They cooked together in the state-of-the-art stainless steel kitchen, walked on the property's private beach, watched from a distance by Marco, and spent evenings reading in silence next to each other in front of the fireplace. He was trying to give her a semblance of normality, but it was a fragile illusion. Sometimes, his other life leaked through. She would hear him in his office, his voice changing, becoming harder, colder, giving orders in Italian. She would see the tension in his shoulders when he hung up the phone. In those moments, he would withdraw from her, retreating into himself, and Nora learned to give him space, knowing he was fighting a war she couldn't see. One afternoon, she was on the terrace, trying to sketch, when Leo approached her. He was the younger of the two, with kind eyes that seemed out of place in his serious face. "Miss Charles," he said respectfully, "Mr. Valenti asked me to let you know he had to step out. He will be back for dinner." "Thank you, Leo." He hesitated, which was unusual for the always professional bodyguard. He cares a great deal for you, miss," he said, almost as a warning. "I've never seen him like this." Leo's words, instead of reassuring her, only heightened her anxiety. She wasn't just a lover. She was a factor in the dangerous equation of Cassian's life, a variable that could put everything at risk. Doubt began to eat at her. Was she doing the right thing by staying? Was her love for him worth the danger she put him in? Did she make him weaker, as his enemy believed? She looked down at her hands, at the invisible ring that now bound her to a world of violence and secrets. The woman who had arrived at this beach, broken and seeking peace, seemed like a stranger now. That night, Cassian came back late, long after dinner. He entered the bedroom silently, where Nora was pretending to sleep. She heard him in the bathroom, the sound of the shower. When he got into bed, she smelled cigar smoke and something metallic that made her stomach turn. She turned to him in the darkness. "Where were you?" He was silent for a moment. "Solving problems." "The rival problem?" she pressed. He sighed. "Yes." "Is it solved?" Another pause. "For now." The answer was not reassuring. "For now" meant there would be an after. She sat up in bed, the silk sheet slipping from her shoulders. "Cassian, I need to know. What do you do? Really. Not investments. I deserve to know the truth." He sat up too, the moonlight tracing the silhouette of his broad shoulders. He looked like a marble statue in the darkness, cold and impenetrable. "I lead my family," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's a business I inherited from my father. We have interests in many areas: construction, shipping, imports. Some of those interests are less legitimate than others, and where there's money and power, there are rivals who want to take it from you, sometimes by force. Family." The word sounded so innocent, but in his context it was heavy with a sinister weight. Mafia. The unspoken word hung in the air between them, ugly and undeniable. "So you're—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I am what I need to be to protect what's mine," he said, his voice hard. my people, my businesses, and now, you. Nora felt a chill run down her spine. It was worse than she had imagined. She wasn't just dating a rich man with secrets. She was in love with the head of a criminal organization. The reality of the situation hit her with full force. All the pieces fell into place. The fortress, the bodyguards, the cold fury, the violence. She started to tremble, not from cold but from shock. "Nora." He reached out to touch her, but she flinched away. Her reaction hit him like a physical blow. The hurt on his face was visible even in the dim light. "I warned you," he whispered, his voice broken. "I told you it was better you didn't know." "What did you expect?" she retorted, her voice thick with the tears that were now streaming freely down her face. "That I'd be okay with this? With the violence? With the fear? I would never let the violence touch you. It already has. It followed me on the road, Cassian. It's on your knuckles and in the smell on your clothes. It's here, in this house, in this bed." The silence that followed was absolute. Nora sobbed quietly, the sound heartbreaking in the stillness of the room. She loved him. God, how she loved him. But how could she reconcile that love with the monstrous truth of who he was? She felt the mattress shift as he got up. He went to the window and stood with his back to her, his hands pressed against the glass, his head bowed. "If you want to leave," he said, his voice muffled, "I'll understand. I'll take you anywhere you want. I'll keep you safe from a distance. You'll never have to see me again." The offer hung in the air, the chance to escape, to go back to safety, to normalcy, to go back to being just Nora Charles, the illustrator with a broken heart. But she knew, with a devastating certainty, that that woman no longer existed. He had changed her. Her love for him, as dangerous as it was, had remade her. She looked at his back. The loneliness that emanated from him was a physical force. She imagined him alone in that huge house, watching the sea, fighting his silent wars, and her heart broke, not from fear, but from love. Slowly she got out of bed and went to him. She stopped behind him and, hesitantly, wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek on his broad, muscular back. She felt him stiffen, then relax into her touch. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered against his skin. "But you have to promise me one thing." He remained silent, waiting. "Don't push me away. Don't hide the truth from me, not anymore. If I'm staying with all of it, the good and the bad." He turned slowly in her arms, holding her face in his hands. Her tears were still wet on her cheeks, and he wiped them away with his thumbs. "Nora," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "you have no idea what you're asking for." "Then show me," she replied, her voice firm. "I'm not weak, Cassian. Let me be strong with you." In that moment, something in his eyes shifted. Respect replaced pity. Admiration replaced fear. He saw her, not as a weakness to be protected, but as a partner, an ally. He kissed her, and the kiss was not of passion or desperation, but of acceptance. A pact sealed in the darkness, with the ocean as their only witness. She had chosen her side in the war, and there would be no turning back. Nora's decision to stay, to accept the totality of who Cassian was, changed the dynamic between them. Frailty gave way to a newfound strength. She stopped seeing herself as a victim of circumstance, and started seeing herself as an active participant in her own life, however dangerous that life had become. Cassian, in turn, stopped treating her like a fragile secret to be hidden. He began to talk. He didn't burden her with sordid details, but he gave her context. He spoke of his father, a relentless old-school man who raised him to be his successor. He spoke of the responsibility he felt for the hundreds of families who depended on his businesses. He painted a picture of a world governed by codes of honor and acts of violence, a precarious balance he struggled to maintain. The rival, a man named Silvio Barone, was from a new generation, more reckless and bloodthirsty, who saw Cassian's attempts to legitimize parts of the business as a sign of weakness. "He doesn't just want my territory," Cassian explained one evening as they watched the sunset from the terrace. "He wants to destroy me. He hates me because my father chose mine, not his to lead." "His father worked for yours?" Nora asked, trying to understand the complex web of loyalties and betrayals. "They were like brothers," Cassian said, a bitter tone in his voice. Until greed poisoned everything. It's an old story. Knowing the truth didn't make things easier, but it made them clearer. Nora's fear didn't disappear, but now it had a name and a face. She began to watch and learn. She watched the way Marco and Leo moved, the way their eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. She learned to recognize the sound of Cassian's cars, to differentiate between a business visit and a threat. She also saw a side of Cassian that few knew. She saw the fierce loyalty he inspired in his men. She saw him settle disputes with a wisdom that belied his brutal reputation. He was a leader, born and bred for it. And, in his own twisted way, he had a code of honor. Her life became a series of surreal contrasts. One moment, she was laughing with Cassian as they tried to make homemade pizza, getting the kitchen messy with flour. The next, she was watching him leave for a late-night meeting, his face a mask of steel, leaving her with a heart tight with anxiety until he returned. The calm, however, was merely the prelude to a new storm. Silvio Barone, humiliated by Cassian's retaliation after the car incident, would not stay quiet for long. The attack came when they least expected it, not with brute force, but with calculated cruelty. It was a sunny afternoon, and Nora, feeling a bit claustrophobic in the mansion, convinced Cassian to let her go to her cottage to get more art supplies. Leo would accompany her. Cassian was reluctant, his protective intuition on high alert. "It's just a few yards away, Cassian. I'll be with Leo. I'll be safe," she argued. He finally agreed, but the worry on his face was evident. "Don't be long, and keep your phone on." The walk to the cottage under the warm sun felt strangely normal. The smell of the sea, the sound of seagulls. For a moment, Nora could almost forget the recent events. While she gathered her canvases and paints, Leo waited outside, alert. When she came out of the cottage carrying a box, she noticed something was wrong. The air was too quiet. Leo was no longer in sight. "Leo," she called, a hint of panic in her voice. No answer. Her heart began to pound. She went around the side of the cottage and saw him. He was lying on the ground near the stone fence, a bleeding head wound. Beside him, a tall, burly man she had never seen before was looking at her with a cruel smile. Nora dropped the box. The scream was trapped in her throat. "The Falcon's little girlfriend," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Silvio sends his regards." She turned to run, but a second man appeared behind her, grabbing her. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was useless. He was much stronger. He pressed a cloth over her nose and mouth. The smell was chemical, sweet, and nauseating. Nora held her breath, but her lungs burned. She was forced to inhale. The world started to spin, colors blurring, sounds distorting. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the man's smiling face and the indifferent blue ocean in the background. When Cassian called Nora's cell phone and she didn't answer, he knew. A cold, primal terror, unlike anything he had ever felt, seized him. He was no longer the calculating Mafia boss. He was a man whose heart had been ripped from his chest. He and Marco ran to the cottage. The scene they found confirmed their worst fears. Leo, groaning in pain, but alive. Nora's box of art supplies dropped on the ground, and no sign of her. The roar that escaped Cassian was not human. It was the sound of a wounded, caged beast. The fury was so intense that Marco, a man who had known him since childhood, took a step back. Cassian's eyes were no longer cold. They burned with the promise of annihilation. He picked up his phone, his hands surprisingly steady. He made a single call. "Get everyone," he said, his voice low and deadly. "Everyone. Silvio Barone just made his last mistake. I'm going to burn his world to the ground." The war was no longer about business or territory. It was personal. Silvio Barone had not just kidnapped the woman he loved. He had signed his own death warrant, and Cassian Valenti, the Falcon, would be his executioner. Nora woke up with a pounding headache and a bitter taste in her mouth. The first thing she registered was the darkness, not the soft darkness of a bedroom at night, but a total, oppressive blackness. The air was damp and smelled of mold and stagnant water. She tried to move and found she was sitting on a cold, wet floor, her hands tied behind her back. Panic hit her like an icy wave, making her heart race. She took a deep breath, trying to fight off the hysteria. Think. Cassian taught you to think. He always told her that fear was a weapon your enemy used against you. She would not let them use it. She tried to remember what happened. The man. The cruel smile. Silvio sends his regards. She was in the hands of Cassian's rival. The realization left her colder than the concrete floor beneath her. They were using her to get to him. A door creaked open, and a strip of yellowish light cut through the darkness, making Nora squeeze her eyes shut. A silhouette appeared in the doorway. "Well, well, the princess is awake," said a voice dripping with sarcasm. The man entered and switched on a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, revealing the room. It was a small, dirty basement with damp stone walls. The man watching her was well-dressed, in an expensive suit and shiny shoes that seemed absurdly out of place in this environment. He was handsome in a predatory way, with slicked-back black hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. This had to be Silvio Barone. "Where am I?" Nora asked, her voice hoarse. "Somewhere safe," Silvio said, circling her like a shark. "Somewhere your boyfriend can't find you. You know, I have to admit, he has good taste. You're much prettier than my men described." "What do you want?" she spat, trying to inject a courage she didn't feel into her voice. "What do I want?" He laughed, an unpleasant sound. "I want everything he has, his businesses, his reputation, and I want to see him on his knees, and you, my dear, are the key to that." He crouched in front of her, his face too close. The scent of his cologne was cloying. "He'll come for you. He'll make mistakes. And when he does, I'll be there to pick up the pieces." Nora stared him down, refusing to look away. "You underestimate him." Silvio's smile faltered for a second. "No, he's the one who underestimates you. He thinks you're a porcelain doll, but I see the fire in your eyes. It's a shame he found you first." He stood up and went to the door. "Enjoy your stay. I hope it won't be too long." The door closed, plunging her back into near-total darkness. Meanwhile, Cassian's mansion had transformed into a war command center. Men loyal to the Valenti family arrived in black cars, their faces grim and determined. Maps and laptops covered the large dining room table. The atmosphere was charged with a silent, deadly tension. Cassian was at the center of it all, a whirlwind of lethal calm. The fear he had felt had crystallized into a singular purpose: find Nora. He didn't sleep, didn't eat. He just drank strong coffee and gave orders, his mind working with frightening clarity. "Silvio is arrogant, but he's not stupid," Cassian said to Marco, his right-hand man. "He won't keep her at any of his known properties. Think of somewhere forgotten, somewhere off the radar." They worked methodically, cross-referencing information, following leads, pressuring informants. Every hour that passed without news was torture for Cassian. The image of Nora's face, her smile, the way her eyes lit up when she looked at him. These memories were both his fuel and his torment. He clung to them, refusing to let the darkness take over. He had promised to protect her, and he would not fail. In the basement, Nora struggled not to lose track of time. She slept in fits, waking to the sound of rats scratching at the walls. They brought her food, bread, and water once a day. She ate, forcing herself to keep up her strength. She spent her waking hours working at her bonds. The ropes were thick, but she discovered that if she twisted her wrists a certain way, she could get a little slack. It was slow, painful work, the rope chafing her skin, but it was something to focus on. It was a fight. On the third day, she did it. With one last painful tug, her right hand came free. The relief was so intense she almost cried. She quickly untied her other hand, the circulation returning with a sharp pain. She was free. At least her hands were. She stood up, her legs wobbly, and began to explore the small basement in the dark. The walls were solid stone. The door was locked from the outside, but there was a small window, high up on the wall, covered by a metal grate. It was her only hope. She dragged an old wooden crate under the window. Climbing on it, she could reach the grate. It was rusted but set firmly in the mortar. She pulled with all her strength. Nothing. She didn't give up. Using a piece of scrap metal she found on the floor, she began to chip away at the mortar around the grate. It was exhausting work. Her nails broke, her fingers bled. But the image of Cassian kept her going. She wasn't going to wait to be rescued like a damsel in distress. She was going to fight. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A terrified, low-level accountant who worked for Barone confessed to one of Cassian's men that Silvio had recently acquired an old, abandoned dockside property under a shell company's name. It was the perfect place. Isolated, forgotten, with countless places to hide someone. Cassian's heart leaped. This was it. He could feel it. He looked at the map of the Docklands area. It was a maze of warehouses and crumbling piers. A frontal assault would be a bloodbath and would put Nora at risk. He needed a plan. Surgical precision. "Marco, get a team of 5 men. The best," Cassian said, his eyes glinting with a predatory intensity. "We're going in quiet, from the water channel. Silvio won't be expecting an attack from the water." The plan was laid out. Fast, silent, deadly. This wasn't a war. It was an extraction and an execution. Cassian geared up, dressing in dark tactical clothing. He checked his weapon with cold efficiency. As he did, his gaze fell on one of Nora's drawings that he had framed and placed on his bedside table. It was a sketch of the ocean, capturing both its beauty and its fury. He touched the glass, his fingertips tracing the lines she had created. "I'm coming, amore mio," he whispered to the drawing. "Hold on." He left the mansion and joined his men in the darkness. The Falcon was going hunting, and he would not return without his prize. The assault boat, a black, low-profile military model, cut through the dark water of the channel without a sound, its electric motor a mere hum. Cassian stood at the bow, the cold night wind hitting his face. He didn't feel it. The only thing he felt was a cold, focused fury that sharpened all his senses. Beside him, his men were silent, their faces shadows in the dark, each a trained and utterly loyal professional. They docked at a crumbling pier, moving like ghosts onto the land. The complex of abandoned warehouses rose against the night sky like the skeletons of industrial giants. The air smelled of rust, decay, and stagnant salt water. Cassian gave a signal, and the team split up, moving in pairs, their weapons ready. Meanwhile, in the basement, Nora finally succeeded. With one last effort, the mortar gave way, and the metal grate came loose in her hands. The sound seemed deafening in the silence. She froze, listening. No sound of approaching footsteps. She let out her breath. She squeezed through the narrow opening, scraping her arms and back, and dropped to the other side, into a dark, trash-filled alley. She was out, but she was far from safe. She was in a labyrinth of derelict buildings, with no idea where to go. She started running, choosing a path at random, keeping to the shadows. Her only thought was to get as far away from that basement as possible. Inside the main warehouse, Cassian's team moved with deadly precision. They neutralized 2 guards outside with silencers before they could raise the alarm. Inside, they met more resistance. Silvio Baroni was in his makeshift office on the mezzanine, playing cards with 2 of his cronies, when he heard the first muffled pop of a gunshot. He stood up, alert. "What was that?" one of his men asked. Before Silvio could answer, his office door was kicked in. Cassian Valenti stood there, a gun in his hand, his eyes burning with an infernal rage. "Valenti!" Silvio spat, reaching for his own gun on the table. It was too late. Marco and Cassian's other men were already in the room, disarming Silvio's goons with brutal efficiency. Cassian walked slowly toward Silvio, his weapon still aimed at his chest. "Where is she?" His voice was dangerously calm. Silvio laughed, a tense, defiant sound. "She's safe. Something you won't be for much longer." He was stalling, hoping his other men in the complex would come to his aid. "Last chance, Silvio. Where is she?" Nora heard the gunshots. She huddled behind a rusty dumpster, her heart pounding wildly. It was them. Cassian. He was here. A wave of relief washed over her, so strong her legs felt weak. But the relief was followed by fear. A battle was taking place, and Cassian was in the middle of it. She had to do something. Hiding was useless. She needed to get out, create a diversion, anything. She looked around and saw an old electrical control panel on the wall of one of the warehouses, its door ajar. A crazy, desperate idea formed in her mind. Back in the office, the tense standoff was broken. Silvio, realizing no reinforcements were coming, made a desperate move. He kicked the table toward Cassian, using the diversion to pull a small pistol from his ankle holster. Cassian dodged the table with agility, but the move gave Silvio the opening he needed. He didn't shoot at Cassian. He aimed at Marco. The shot echoed in the confined space. Marco cried out and fell, clutching his leg. In that split second of distraction, as Cassian's attention turned to his wounded friend, Silvio ran. He bolted out of the office and down the metal stairs, heading for the back exit. Cassian didn't hesitate. "Take care of him," he yelled to his men, referring to Marco, and took off after Silvio. The chase took them through the maze of rusted machinery on the warehouse floor. Silvio fired wildly behind him, bullets ricocheting off the metal structures. Cassian moved with a lethal grace, using the shadows and cover, not wasting a single shot. That's when all the lights in the complex went out. Nora had found the main breaker in the control panel, and with a heave of all her strength, plunged the entire complex into absolute darkness. It was a gamble. It could hinder Cassian's men as much as Silvio's, but her gut told her that Cassian, the Falcon, would see better in the dark. The sudden blackness disoriented Silvio. He stumbled and fell. Cassian, whose eyes were already adjusting, was on him in an instant. He kicked the gun from Silvio's hand, the metal skittering across the concrete floor. Silvio scrambled to his feet, panic in his eyes. "You won't kill me in cold blood, Valenti. You're not your father." "You're right," Cassian said, his voice a deadly whisper in the dark. "I'm not my father." He didn't shoot. He lowered his gun and hit him. And again. It was primal, brutal. It was all the anger, all the fear, all the agony of the past 3 days released in an explosion of controlled violence. Panting, he finally stopped, looming over Silvio's beaten, groaning body. Justice would be served. But not here. Not like this. Silvio's life was ruined, his power broken. Prison or exile would be a fate worse than death for a man like him. "Nora!" Cassian's voice echoed through the darkness. "Nora, where are you?" "I'm here," she cried out from her hiding place. Following the sound of her voice, he found her. She emerged from behind the dumpster, and they ran toward each other. When he reached her, he swept her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her scent, making sure she was real, that she was safe. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "You found me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I knew you would." He pulled back to look at her, his hands cupping her face. He saw the scrapes, the bruises, her bloodied hands, and his heart both broke and swelled with a fierce pride. "Your hands," he said, taking them gently. "I got myself free," she said, her voice filled with a newfound strength. "And I turned out the lights." A slow smile spread across Cassian's face, a smile of pure admiration and love. "I know," he said. "My brave Nora." He kissed her, right there, in the middle of the ruined dock complex, surrounded by the darkness and the debris of the battle. The kiss wasn't about passion, but about relief. It was the promise of a safe harbor after the most violent storm of their lives. The war was over, and they had won together. The sunrise over the ocean had never looked so beautiful. Nora stood on the balcony of Cassian's mansion, wrapped in a soft blanket, a cup of hot tea warming her hands. The sky was painted in shades of pink, orange, and gold. It was the first morning of her new life. The last few days had been a blur. After the rescue, Cassian had brought her home, tending to her injuries with a tenderness that made her cry. He didn't leave her side for a second. Marco was recovering well, and Silvio Barone and his men had been delivered to the authorities in a way that ensured they would spend a long time behind bars, thanks to a dossier of their illegal activities that Cassian had conveniently provided. Barone's empire crumbled overnight. Cassian stepped out onto the balcony, bringing more tea. He stood behind Nora, wrapping his arms around her, resting his chin on the top of her head. They stood in silence for a long time, just watching the day begin. "I can't do this anymore," he said finally, his voice low. Nora's heart clenched. "He's going to send me away," she thought, "to protect me." She turned in his arms to face him. "Do what?" "This," he said, gesturing to the world around them. "This life, the violence, the fear. I almost lost you, Nora. That's a risk I'm not willing to take again. When I thought Silvio, when I thought about what he could do to you, something inside me broke. Or maybe something was fixed. Nora waited, her heart in her throat. It will take time, he continued, his dark eyes serious and filled with a new determination. But I'm getting out. I'm going to legitimize everything. Sell off the parts that can't be cleaned. Strengthen the ones that can. There will be consequences. We'll lose power, money. I'll make new enemies. But I can't be the man you deserve, and continue to be the man my father raised me to be. Tears filled Nora's eyes, but this time they were tears of joy and relief. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. He wasn't choosing between her and his world. He was choosing to build a new world, with her. You don't have to do this for me, Cassian, she whispered. I'm not doing it for you, he said, caressing her cheek. I'm doing it for us. You showed me there's a different way to be strong, a better way. This was her happily ever after. Not a fairy tale, but a promise of hard work, of challenges, and of a future they would build together, brick by brick. In the months that followed, their lives changed. The mansion, once a silent fortress, began to feel more like a home. Nora filled the walls with her paintings, vibrant colors that contrasted with the concrete and steel. The sound of music, not just Mahler, but the indie rock Nora loved, often filled the air. Pip the dog now had free run of every room, often found sleeping at Cassian's feet in his office. Cassian's process of untangling himself from his past was, as he predicted, long and dangerous. There were threats, betrayals, and nights when he came home with the weight of the world on his shoulders. But this time, Nora was there. She wasn't waiting on the outside of his world. She was at the center of it. She listened to him, advised him, and her quiet strength became his anchor. She found her own strength, too. The experience with Silvio had changed her. She was no longer a woman running from a broken heart. She was a survivor. Her art flourished, imbued with a new depth and emotion. She received an offer from a prestigious gallery in the city, and for the first time, she felt truly like an artist. 1 year after the day she arrived at the cottage, Nora stood on the beach, in the same spot where she had first seen Cassian. The cottage was now her permanent art studio. The sun was setting, painting the sky with the same colors as that first morning together. Cassian came up behind her and slid his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a murmur in her ear. "I'm thinking about how a person can feel so lost, and then somehow find their way home in a place they never expected." He turned her to face him. The man looking back at her now was different. The hard edges were still there. The intensity in his eyes would never fully disappear. But there was a peace in him that hadn't existed before. There was happiness. He took a small velvet box from his pocket. Nora's heart stopped. "Nora Charles," he said, his voice deep and full of emotion. "You came into my life like a storm, tearing down every wall I ever built. You taught me to fight for something more than just survival. You taught me to fight for happiness. I'm not a man of poetry, and my past will always be a part of who I am. But I know this. Every single day of my life, I want to spend trying to be the man you already believe I am." He opened the box. Inside, a simple, elegant diamond ring glittered in the twilight. "Marry me," he whispered. Tears streamed down Nora's face as she smiled. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes. Of course, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. He kissed her. A kiss that wasn't about escape or danger, but about a home found, about a future promised, and about a love that had proven stronger than the darkness. There, on the beach where she had come to run from love, she had found not only the love of her life, but herself. And together, they looked out at the horizon, ready for whatever storm came next, knowing that as long as they had each other, they would always find their way back to the light.